Es un verdadero honor y un placer, profesora Nussbaum, estar aquí con usted. Eh, Muchas gracias por sus palabras necesarias hoy para el mundo entero y para Colombia en la conversación con Azucajas. Y eh, quiero primero decirle que decidimos conversar con usted, Claudia Restrepo y yo, porque hace unos meses tomamos la decisión de que siempre que hiciéramos una conversación académica, ciudadana, para empresas, iba a ser hombres y mujeres, mayoría mujeres o al menos equilibrado hombres y mujeres. Entonces queríamos hacerlo Claudia y yo, además de que ambos somos grandes seguidores de su trabajo. En Confama nos inspiramos mucho en sus ideas, capacidades humanas, el valor y los retos de la educación, las emociones como un asunto fundamental para comprender a la especie humana y vivir mejor en democracia, género, envejecimiento, las humanidades y las artes, nuestros colegios, nuestro instituto técnico, nuestros centros culturales, profesora Nussbaum, están en buena medida inspirados en sus libros, que seguimos y conversamos de ellos con frecuencia. Incluso nuestra organización pretende ser una organización llena de conversaciones filosóficas. Y buscamos, una de nuestras misiones en el mundo es generar en el mundo empresarial de nuestra región eh, más conversaciones de filosofía y de política, más reflexión ciudadana. De las capacidades de las que habla en su libro, Crear capacidades, quisiéramos que nos contara un poco más de sentidos, imaginación y pensamiento. Esa en particular nos toca profundamente. También usted habla en su libro Sin fines de lucro alrededor del cultivo de la imaginación y del papel que tienen las humanidades y las artes para cultivar la imaginación. Estamos en un momento donde los líderes empresariales y muchos líderes políticos solo hablan de educación técnica, de educación para el trabajo. Doctora Nussbaum, ¿por qué son importantes las humanidades, las artes, el teatro, el juego para generar esta forma de imaginación?
People sometimes think that the imagination and the emotions happen naturally and they don't need to be educated. And that's a big mistake. First of all, emotions are culturally shaped. So the degree to which people will have retributive anger, or by contrast, a spirit of hope and forgiveness, this is mediated by culture. It doesn't just happen naturally by birth. And so we all have an obligation, therefore, to figure out how on earth to educate the emotions well rather than badly, including, let's say, how would we educate people so as to have less contempt for people with disabilities? Now, this just to choose a problem that's very much a part of another book of mine. Well, one part is the structure of the classroom. One has to include people with many different types of disabilities in the common classroom. But then the discussion must include a kind of spirit of mutuality and respect and cultivate emotions of friendship rather than emotions of fear, because people always used to be terribly afraid of people who looked different from others. And so, put the fear aside, get children playing and interchanging together. So in every place where society has constructed fear and anger, the schools need to do something differently and construct cooperation. And that's the kind of education of the emotions. But the imagination, too, is kind of children are born with the capacity to look at the world from another person's point of view. We know this by psychologists who have done experiments on very young babies. They do have this ability to look at the world from another viewpoint. But as time goes on, it often becomes weak and narrow. After all, people need to expand the imagination. They're not born with the capacity to see what the world looks like from the point of view of a minority in their own society. That's a very special training of the imagination that comes later and by effort. And that's where literature and the arts come in. Literary works can give you, as I said, when I talked about Ralph Ellison, an experience of pleasure while at the same time you're doing something very strange that you didn't do before. That is, you're working on your inner eyes to see better the reality of, for example, an African American life or a life of a woman or whatever it might be. So it's the way that the arts combine pleasure, participation, and then the challenge of difference that makes them such powerful vehicles for the education of the imagination and the emotions.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. You're like a heroine for me. In many of your books, you speak about emotions as if it's a capacity, a capability, a very important one. Especially you talk about two emotions which really resonate with me, which are compassion and love, which are two type of emotions that we have to cultivate. And your book, in fact, uh, landscape of the imagination. You say you tie in emotional health and bioethics like reciprocity, giving back. And could you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, compassion, of course, it's one of those emotions where it's very important to understand that it's not just a natural instinct. To some extent, it probably is a natural instinct. I think that young children, we see in experiments that babies feel distress when they hear other babies cry. So there's a kind of instinctive part to compassion. But in the end, as we grow older, it has to be mediated by thought. And we have to understand, for example, that the other person is suffering. That's not automatically understood by people. For example, most people don't have any compassion for the suffering of animals that are treated brutally in the meat industry. This is the subject of the book I'm writing now. And they just think, oh, this is something that just happens and it's not bad and so on. And they don't even believe that the animals are suffering. So we have to understand what situations are bad. And we have to understand also, if we're really going to have compassion, when it's the fault of the person and when it's not their fault. Because in compassion, we're usually saying, you're suffering and you didn't deserve that. You didn't bring it on yourself. So there are a lot of things that we need to learn. Often, you can understand this by reading literature of earlier times when there was a rejection of compassion, where, let's say, African Americans were treated as like cattle who didn't really suffer when they were treated brutally, or women were treated as inferior beings who didn't really suffer when they were denied political participation or higher education. So even literature can show you the blind spots of an earlier era. So then once we see the blind spots of our own culture, we need works of art that help cultivate, as Ellison said, our inner eyes so that we can see what it is that somebody is missing who's denied a higher education, who's denied access to politics. And we learn, oh, it's not just natural for women to be denied all that. So, I mean, of course, then you have to figure out which works you would turn to make that realization much more vivid. And you probably want works that are participatory, not just sitting and reading. This is what Tagore did in his school, where women were regarded as people who should have shame and they must cover themselves. And so he got everyone dancing together, and it was really very shocking. Amita Sen, she died at the age of 92, and she would tell me about the way they shocked the audiences when they did these dances, where, of course, they had to stay within a certain boundary in order not to be closed down, but they did do dances that were quite daring. And she was a leading dancer, so she enjoyed this especially. And it was part of his way of getting women not to feel shame, because he couldn't just say to the women, now you stop feeling shame. That wouldn't happen. Culture would oppress them again. But to say, now I want you to leap from this point to this point in just the way I'm showing you, that they could regard that as an educational task that they must do. And he was a dancer too. And one of the beautiful parts of Anita's book is where she describes Tagore himself dancing the role of a blind outcast who is in chains, and he's dancing and he's saying, my chains, I will break my chains. And she says, all we young women, we understood that it was also about us. And we really were so excited to see, but to see his body doing these movements of the blind man breaking his chains. And so this was fantastic. And I think that we just must find always ways of making young people participate, if you will, in the breaking of other people's chains and their own, of course.
Alguna vez leí
Once I read
que Krishnamurti
that
señalaba, Krishnamurti decía que el fin último de la educación es eliminar el miedo. Uno de los miedos más grandes que tenemos los seres humanos es el miedo a envejecer y a la muerte. En su hermosísimo libro de Envejecer con sentido, Aging Thoughtfully, inspirado en De la senectud de Cicerón, de sus conversaciones con el profesor Saul Levmore, usted habla de esa realidad que es envejecer, que tiene una mezcla de inevitable con muchísima belleza y también con muchas tristezas. Y quisiera que nos contara un poco de eso, del valor de la amistad y del valor del trabajo cuando van pasando los años, profesora Nussbaum.
Well, I don't agree that we should eliminate fear, because fear is the understanding that there are bad things that are outside of you that will threaten the things you care about. Well, of course, there are many times when we're afraid wrongly, and those we should eliminate. We should not be panicked. But there are times, where there really is something to fear. Illness is something to fear. And, take the coronavirus. If we didn't have that fear, we wouldn't try to construct policies that keep ourselves and other people safe. And I'm afraid that Americans in many parts of the country have too little fear, especially the young ones. So Illinois has had very tight restrictions, and we're now doing quite well. But Wisconsin next door has this Republican administration that thinks, oh, everyone should go out and go to the bars and party, and so have no fear. And, they're now having a real epidemic. And young people also in colleges and universities who think, oh, we'll have no fear and we'll go and party. And so, no, I think fear on behalf of yourself is rational, but also fear on behalf of other people. These college students who are going and drinking and partying, what do they think? They're not going to spread it to other people. So anyway, so I think fear is reasonable. But as to aging, I think what I thought was Cicero was really, really right to say and to show that friendship and conversation and continued involvement in work are the really important things that make a life go well as one ages. And he had a terrible set of losses. In fact, I feel closer to Cicero even now than before, because I too lost my only daughter last year, and the loss of a child, which Cicero expresses very powerfully. I too feel that's a particularly terrible loss, because if you're aging, but you actually lose somebody who's much younger, who was a future, well, that's a pretty terrible thing. But you get through it, I think, by caring about other people, by talking to people, by continuing. I mean, teaching is something that connects me, of course, every day with people. And I wish it was in person. I wish I could teach my students in person, but I do have a smaller circle of friends that I see in person. I go out to outdoor restaurants, because it's getting colder now. And so the time we go out, eat outdoors is getting shorter. But anyway, friendship, conversation, and also work. I think it's important. And it's important to feel that the work is meaningful. In my case, my daughter was a lawyer for the rights of animals, and I'm writing a book about that. So I feel that helps me to feel that I'm continuing her commitments and that I can do something that represents what she cared about is very precious to me. So I think we all must remain active and hopeful and can make contributions to other people is the main thing. Otherwise, you just might as well go and sit by yourself and be very sad.
Marvelous. I can't forgo the opportunity as a leader and feminist in a society that is still very machista to ask you about gender. You in your book about women and human pain, you gave certain first points about capabilities, and you even dare to say that politics and economy should have a feminist frame of mind. Could you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Well, okay. First, I should say I've got this new book coming out in May, which is about sexual assault, and it's an attempt to diagnose the problems in a society that's too machisto. Namely, the kind of, what is it that makes so many people, a lot of the men, treat other people like mere objects whose reality doesn't count. So the book is actually about the vice of pride, and it's called Citadels of Pride: Sexual Abuse, Accountability, and Reconciliation. And what I mean by pride, I draw on Dante here, is the idea that you see only yourself and other people like you. Other people are just too much below you, and they're just like instruments. And I think that's a very common vice in all societies, and it takes different forms. There's racial pride, but very much there is gender pride, thinking that women are mere helpmates, instruments of male accomplishment. Now, of course, what that does, it impoverishes women, very obviously, makes them vulnerable to many abuses, but it also impoverishes the whole of society, because women are, roughly speaking, half of the society. And how can a society actually make progress if half of its members are being treated as though they don't really count? So that's what I meant by saying the society should have a feminist spirit, a spirit of inclusion, that we're all going to participate together. We're not going to have half of the people treated as mere helpmates and servants of the other half, but we'll all work together. And, I think it's happening more and more. I do feel that. In the US, I see changes in the way the legal profession is going, in the way the political parties are working. We have now a female mayor in Chicago. She's female, she's African-American, and a lesbian. So she three firsts all in one, and a lawyer as well. But anyway, we have that. And then there are many women in politics all around. So it's really a time when women are finally finding their way. And in the academy, that's happened a little bit earlier, but it's still a struggle. So, it makes no sense for a society to create these ranks and hierarchies, because inevitably, it's first of all very exhausting to keep people in subordination. You lose out on pleasure and flourishing that you could have, because I think that a relationship of equality is much more fun and interesting than a relationship of subordination. But the whole society loses out if the talents of half of the people are not cultivated. In higher education, women are now equal to men in pretty much every country. But then what happens later? Their talents are not fully used because of the division of labor in the household. So again, a feminist consciousness would mean thinking about these things, thinking about who does the labor of housework, caring for children, caring for people who are aging. And we all have to solve these problems together. We just can't assume that there's this underclass, namely women, who do all this without pay just because it's their nature. We have to realize that care is a problem and we solve it together.
Tal vez una última pregunta, profesora Nussbaum. el público que la está escuchando y que nos escucha muchas veces a organizaciones como nosotros es el público de líderes del mundo empresarial, de los negocios. Cada vez en el mundo se está hablando más de transformar los negocios. Se está hablando del capitalismo consciente, se está hablando de las empresas activistas por causas de derechos de las mujeres, del medio ambiente, etcétera. Mm, pero poco se habla de la responsabilidad que los empresarios tienen frente a la democracia. Entonces quería saber si tiene algún consejo, algún pensamiento para compartirle a los líderes de las grandes empresas y su responsabilidad para fortalecer y cuidar la democracia.
Well, this goes back to something we were talking about before, where I do think it begins with the education in professional schools, where, as I said, I think the medical schools have done very well with this, in injecting a spirit of participatory ethical dialogue into the education in medical school. And then when they go out later, renewing it by participation and dialogue in the process of assembling teams that work on specific diseases. Law is doing not so well, but well in education, but they're not so well in the firms, but we have to do better. And there are individual firms that do better. The business world, I think it's full of good ideas. I do think that the Apple is a good model, and I suppose people can always study the successful firms and look at what they're doing. But what Apple does is, I mean, basically the idea is that we're not in it just to make money. We make money by making the imagination work. We make a contribution that is imaginative and also ethical. And of course, they constantly talk about their labor relations with other countries. Are the workers for Apple in China paid badly or not? And so my friend Josh Cohen, the philosopher who works for them, he was actually sent over to China to study labor relations and to see what's really going on with the Apple workers in China, which was not so obvious from a distance. So, you know, these kinds of things, when a firm really decides we're going to do things ethically, then I think the public does respond to that. We have a whole kind of marketing now of certain products as ethically sourced. I mean, they're when I go and shop, I can buy ethically sourced fish or whatever. And similarly, you know, if you know that a certain product is made in a workplace where there really is a robust ethical culture and one that's more democratic, which invites the young workers to participate in a dialogue, I think that is something that rightly that firm will advertise, and the public will respond to that. And I do believe that the public responds. I actually think a lot of businesses are ahead of the rest of the culture. A lot of the progress in my book about sexual abuse, I talk a lot about the sports world, which fascinates me. The sports world, you know, it's the pressure of the consumers, the businesses, the beer companies. They say, well, we don't want to sponsor the football games if they're people who are, let's say, assaulting women and there has been no penalty. So they are the ones who are driving change in respect of gender relations. And the reason for that is they know that they're people who buy beer care about that. Actually, women drink beer. And so, you know, they have to pay attention, because if to the extent that women are doing the shopping for the household, they make the choices. So I actually think business is more responsive than some other institutions in the society, because they know they got to be if they want people to keep buying their products.
Thank you. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation with you too. I've really enjoyed this, and both of you have asked wonderful questions.